Okay, hello everyone. My name is Nicola Piras, and I am a postdoc fellow in the philosophy department at the University of Milan. And welcome to this meeting of the 2022 spring session of the Half-Baked Online Colloquia series. This series is part of the activities of Culinary Mind, a leading international center promoting philosophical thinking on food. This series is organized by Andrea Borghini from the University of Milan, Megan Dean from Michigan State University, Beatrice Serini from the University of Milan, and myself. The series aims to highlight new work on philosophical issues that pertain to food and eating practices, to spark discussion and debate, and to connect scholars working in this area. If you want to retrieve videos of our past events, you can visit our webpage section media. If you want to stay up to date to the news on Culinary Mind, please subscribe to our mailing list on our webpage or text us. Now, it's a pleasure for me to introduce you Matthew Ruby. Matthew is a lecturer at La Trobe University and obtained his PhD from the University of British Columbia. His research centers on the conflict between people's desire for meat and the cost of indulging this desire. In particular, he investigates how people decide which animal foods are acceptable to eat and which are not, how people reconcile the dissonance between loving meat and loving animals, and how omnivores and vegetarians perceive one another. So thank you very much, Matthew. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, Nicola. Let me just do the screen share here. All right, it should now be showing you my screen, yes?
Yeah.
All right, fantastic. So again, thank you everybody for coming at this rather early hour over in Italy and well past the end of the workday here in Australia. Today, the meaning of food in life, insights from 11 countries. But before I launch into the actual presentation itself, I want to take a moment to do an acknowledgement of country, which familiar to those of you in Italy, but I basically want to acknowledge that I am working and presenting from unceded Aboriginal land down here in Australia, and I would like to pay my respects to Indigenous elders past, present, and emerging, and I would normally extend that respect to any Indigenous people in the audience. I don't know if that's currently the case, but if you're there, I you. And I am joining you all from beautiful Boonwurrung country, also known as St. Kilda, down near the Melbourne CBD. All right, so in my talk today, I'm going to give a perhaps very brief background behind the research that I'm going to be presenting, because at the end, I will then walk you through rather briefly some of the my colleagues and I did to develop the Meaning of Food in Life questionnaire, or the MFLQ, present a bit more recent research where we tested the MFLQ down under here in Australia, and then a bit more recently testing the MFLQ around the world in 10 different countries. Hopefully a little bit of time to talk about some ongoing work that we're doing theoretically this very minute, testing an expanded version of the MFLQ in an array of different countries. Now, this probably comes to no surprise to any of you, given who the audience is, but food choices are rich in rich in meaning. So they can carry symbolic meaning, social meaning, economic meaning. In many traditional cultures throughout the world, people very explicitly believe you are what you eat, on the properties of the foods that they eat. And even among many industrialized Western societies, people implicitly hold this belief. There's been some really classic research by Nemiroff and Rosen showing that even among American college undergraduates, with a bit of clever experimental design, it turns out that people do still hold this belief that the people take on the properties of the foods that they eat. There's been quite a lot of classic work showing that the way in which people relate to food and the way that people think about food and eating can vary dramatically across and within cultures. Some really classic work by Rosen, Fischler, and colleagues have looked at French versus US American relations to foods. And in essence, they found that generally speaking, in France, people are much more concerned about the quality of food, about taking time, about enjoying it, commensality, sharing the process of eating. Whereas in America, the priorities tend on average to be quite different. There's much more of an emphasis on quantity than quality. Food isn't necessarily as intensely social. It's a lot more individualistic. People tend to kind of go for whatever the heck it is that they want. And the phenomenon of the all-you-can-eat buffet, it's a huge phenomenon in the United States, and at least many of my French colleagues look upon the idea with considerable distaste. Why would you want to go to a place that just serves mountains and mountains of food when you could go and get something perfectly good in smaller portions? So that's a very basic sort of overview of that. And there's also some really strong evidence that people hang on to their culinary traditions much more tightly than many other traditions when they move to different cultural contexts. So, more than way of dress, more than language, people tend to cling very, very tightly to their traditional meals, their traditional customs around the dinner table. Within the US, we have a very large set of Italian American communities, and it's quite a phenomenon in the United States referred to as the traditional Sunday dinner, that as more and more Italians were moving to the United States and assimilating into the culture to greater or lesser degrees, the last thing to be given up, and in many cases, the one thing that was not ever given up, was this connection to traditional Italian cuisine and having the family dinner on Sundays. Where there was some interesting variation is what they call it. There was and is very heated debate over what to call the Sunday meal. There's parts of the United States where they refer to having the Sunday gravy, and by gravy they mean the sugo, the tomato-based thing, which to most other parts of the country it's really strange to call something gravy when it doesn't have animal fat in it. Other parts of the country call it sauce, other parts call it sugo. And there's a lot of debate fought over what to call this traditional meal, which I'd be very curious later on to hear what the Italians think about calling, a ragu or something like that a gravy, because it just does my head in. All right. And in terms of the bulk of the research that's being done on food, there's been quite a lot done over the years trying to figure out why people eat what they eat on a very basic level. And Paul Rosen has said that, yes, there's lots of sort of fancy research out there looking at the really subtle drivers of food choice, the different influences that can take place. But when it comes down to it, two of the really biggest drivers of food choice are really simple: availability and liking. If food's not available, people can't eat it. If it's there, they're more likely to. And people tend to eat things that they think taste good. Moving beyond that, of course, there have been quite a number of more elaborated models of food choice. One of the most famous ones probably would be the food choice process model by First and colleagues, which looks at a number of different factors. So people eating particular things out of concern for safety, convenience, comfort, sensory appeal. Another more recent approach growing in popularity is the Eating Motivation Survey, which was created by Britta Renner and colleagues over at the Universität Konstanz. This has a much broader array of facets that it focuses on. It focuses on, last I checked, 15, but soon I think 18 different facets, ranging from people eating what they eat due to pleasure, due to personal habits, due to tradition, concern for maintaining their social image, trying to be healthy, and so on. But generally speaking, in the psychological literature, at least, which I'm sure differs quite a lot from the philosophical literature, there's been relatively little focus on the meaning of what people eat and why they eat it. There are some notable exceptions. So Brunso and Grunert and colleagues have done quite a bit of stuff around the idea of food-related lifestyle. So measuring, for example, the extent to which people are involved deeply in food and eating via items like eating and drinking are a continuous source of joy, They tend to look a lot at innovation, so the extent to which people like to try new foods they've never tried before, and what they call responsibility, so people trying to choose food produced with minimal impact on the environment, trying to buy more locally, trying to protect animal welfare. But these particular studies are relatively rare in the field of psychology. A lot of what's being done has been focused on sort of what exactly people are eating, the implications for a very limited measure, a very limited number of physical health outcomes. And a lot of it has been characterized by what Skrinis, who I'm pleased in the audience, is in the audience today, refers to as nutritionism, that there's this, especially in America, there's this really overwrought focus on very particular minutiae of the nuts and bolts of what people are eating without zooming out to the larger cultural context. And this is really quite striking because there's a very large body of psychological research out there showing that meaning making is something that's incredibly central to human life, that humans are driven to make sense of the world and to extract a sense of meaning, even from sort of random stimuli where there objectively is no sense of meaning. Humans have this drive to try and make sense of things and sort of integrate a coherent view. And food is not an incidental thing. It's a very central part of human existence. We literally would not be alive without it. But the extent to which it has a central focus in society does vary quite a bit across culture and across time. So here we have a table showing a bit of a cross-section of different countries throughout the world, ranging from the US and UK to Brazil and Turkey to Russia, India, Nigeria, showing the percent of money expended on food consumed at home versus sort of in general. And as of 2016, at least, the total consumer expenditures per person. So you can see that there's a lot of variation here in terms of how much it is that people are actually spending on their food in absolute terms and in relative terms. So yes, food has a lot of these rich meanings, but it's been largely ignored in the psychological literature. Despite this, over the past decade in particular, there's been a growing array of different ads out there that are specifically appealing to people's values. When my colleagues and I first started with this project considerably some time ago, we were really quite taken by a lot of the Whole Foods ads at the time. So we were quite taken with this one in particular. Good food can be even better. If you zoom in, it talks about values mattering and that we think food tastes even better when you also love the way it's grown, which at the time was perhaps a bit of an ambitious statement, but since then there has been quite a few studies showing that when people believe that food has been produced in a more ethical manner, they actually report it tasting better, enjoying it more, even if there's actually no difference between conditions. If people think it was produced in a more ethical way, they often report enjoying eating it more. So a lot of the early work that I'll be presenting today was done in collaboration with Naomi Arbit and Paul Rosen, who I know a number of you know. This first set of studies was the bulk of Naomi's doctoral thesis that Paul and I co-supervised. And what we were trying to do in this work was to try and develop a way of measuring the meaning that food holds in people's lives, but with a relatively tight and robust scale. And because there are many different ways of defining what meaning means, we came in with the idea that the meaning of food in life represents the degree to which people feel and comprehend their relationship with their food as having significance beyond just the immediate demands of the situation and as connected to their larger life world. So a little bit more zoomed out than many of the scales that had come before that. We initially recruited a swath of people across 3 different studies from Mechanical Turk. I won't belabor the numbers too much here, but relatively evenly balanced in terms of gender. That shouldn't say 4.6. I think that's 44.6. Apologies for that. Most people were in their 30s, relatively white/Caucasian centered sample, but a fair bit of other cultural diversity. And we collected these data around 2016. Oh, all good? Okay, good. And in the course of the first 3 studies, we developed and extracted and replicated 5 pretty consistent factors. So there's the moral meaning of food in life, measured by items such as I care about the impact of my food choice on the world. When I eat food, I think about where it came from, and I eat in a way that expresses care for the world. There's the social meaning of food in life. So food being closely tied to relationships with others, feeling connected to other people you share a meal with, and so on. There's the sacred meaning of food in life. So people eating foods that reflect their spiritual beliefs, or holding the belief that from a spiritual perspective, some foods are better than others. The aesthetic or the foodie domain. So the idea that preparing a good meal is like making a work of art, or being able to appreciate the beauty of a dish, even if you don't personally like it. And then, because we kind of had to, there's also the health domain. So getting satisfaction from knowing that the food one eats is good for one's health, feeling that nourishing one's body is a meaningful activity, and so on. Across these initial studies, we found that these items, they're highly internally consistent. So each of the items in the moral domain cohere the other moral items. Each of the items in the social domain tend to be scored very similar to the other social items. It's quite stable over time. So how people answer now versus 2 weeks from now are very, very similar. The factors are moderately intercorrelated with each other. So if somebody scores high in the social domain, they tend to also score higher in the other domains, but there is quite a bit of differentiation. And then we showed, as part of the usual scale development process, that it maps on where it should to different parts of the eating motivation scale. So, the social domain maps onto the social type items from the TEMS, but that it's also quite different from things that shouldn't be related, like the Dutch eating behavior questionnaire. So dietary restraint had very little to do, for example, with a number of the domains that we looked at here. In terms of how our American samples responded, this is an average of how participants in the initial studies responded. The possible range was from 3, meaning that they completely and fully endorse the domain, it's really, really meaningful, and a -3 means that they completely reject it, that they don't at all endorse it. And you can see here that aesthetic and health were quite high for our American participants. Social, somewhere in the middle. Moral, they kind of agreed with, and on average, they weren't particularly taken with the sacred domain. It didn't rate terribly much for most participants. And we found that the extent to which people endorsed these different domains was quite strongly predictive of their current dietary behavior and some of their attitudes around food. So perhaps not surprisingly, but the more that people agreed that food had a moral meaning in their lives and that they cared about what they ate and its impact on the world, the less meat they reported eating, the more money they were willing to pay to promote animal welfare and environmental welfare. They tended to report eating more local food and more organic food. And interestingly, they reported overall having better subjective health. So, reporting from poor to excellent, those who had a stronger moral meaning of food in their lives just said they were healthier. The sacred domain was very similar to the moral domain, but about half the predictive power. And we think this is perhaps because the overall endorsement of the sacred domain in our American sample, which was largely secular, was quite low. The social domain, again, perhaps not super surprising, but those who reported a high social meaning tended to respond more to external eating cues. So what those around them are doing, what sort of food is available immediately around them. But interestingly, they also reported spending that they ate more local and organic food, perhaps sort of concern for those around them wanting to look virtuous. The aesthetic, again, very similar to the social meaning in terms of the patterns that came through, except interestingly, those who scored high in the aesthetic domain also scored higher on the personality measure of being more open to experience. So trying new things, trying different ways of thinking. The health domain, more or less what you'd expect. So the more that people said that food had a health meaning in their lives, the less they ate highly processed fast food, candy and soda, the more they reported eating fruits and vegetables. They said they would eat less meat. They drank more water as opposed to other beverages. And again, as one would hope, they reported overall that their health was better. Now, we initially developed the scale only with US Americans, and although we gathered quite a bit of evidence about its suitability there, we really didn't know whether the scale structure would replicate in another culture and whether similar relationships would emerge. Happily, for the life of this project, around the time that we were asking these questions, I had a tree change down to Australia, so we decided it might be nice to do a conceptual replication of the early studies, seeing whether similar patterns might emerge here down under. So in mid-2018, a bunch of my students and I created a bunch of targeted social media posts aimed at Australians aged 18 and above. We got about 300 participants, primarily women, primarily people in their late 20s to early 30s, as is typical of food research online, it seems. Relatively diverse in terms of education level. Again, mostly people of European descent, but a reasonable amount of other ethnic backgrounds being represented. And this will mean a lot more to those familiar with Australia, but the majority of our population was living in major cities of Australia, so places marked in red on the map here, and then a bit more in the inner regions here in yellow, and then a very small number in the outer regions, and almost nobody in basically the middle of the country. And in terms of what we found, our 5-factor structure of the 5 major domains largely replicated so well that it was a little bit scary, except the item food is a way to connect with my cultural traditions, making food for others is a main way I show care for them, and I can appreciate the beauty of a dish even if I don't like it. Those items didn't load particularly well. Our participants didn't seem to respond to those in the same way as the Americans. But overall, the reliability of each of the scales was quite similar to what it was in the American sample. And when we looked at people's reported food intake and their overall dietary self-efficacy, so the extent to which they believe they can make healthy food choices on a consistent basis, it was quite similar to what we got for the Americans, that the moral and the health factors did a lot of the heavy lifting, and they correlated significantly with everything, and the social, sacred, and aesthetic had much less of a relationship with what people were actually eating, but were related more to their attitudes, which I didn't have room to squeeze in today, but I'd be happy to follow up on later on if that was of interest. So we generally replicated the initial studies with the Australian sample. So we thought, okay, well, let's start with Australia and then move on to a broader section of the world and find out whether these 5 domains also emerge in a much broader array of different countries. And also try and see how strongly these different domains are endorsed. So thankfully, we were able to include this work as part of a larger project known as the TEP10, or the Eating Project 10, led by researchers at the University of Konstanz, targeting all the cultures of the countries that are in blue here. So ranging from the US and Mexico to Brazil, to Ghana, Turkey, Japan, India, China, and so on. Here we have a picture from one of our group meetings pre-COVID, back when these were still a thing. And we have, again, a broad array of people here from each of the countries, including Usha Menon, Gulbanu Kaptan, Claude Fischler, Paul Rosen, Britta Renna, and in the middle, our fearless leader, Dr. Gudrun Sprosso, who's done some really fascinating work around food choice. For those who may not be as familiar with her, I definitely recommend you go and take a look at some of her work. I'm mindful of the time, so I'm going to go over the methodological details a little bit faster than I was planning to save room for discussion. So basically, it was a big undertaking. We recruited people from November 2017 to 2018, targeting people who'd lived most of their life or their childhood in the country or region that we were targeting. As part of this larger study on traditional and modern eating. In all 10 countries, we had some people complete online surveys, some people do actual physical pen and paper surveys, and then additionally, because of issues with internet penetration, we had some people do face-to-face interviews in parts of rural Ghana so that we could get a bit more representation there. Everything done in the local languages, all materials translated back, translated in the usual fashion. We ended up with just shy of 4,000 participants. The numbers did vary quite a bit from country to country. So in Brazil, we got nearly 900 people, whereas in France and Ghana, we got far fewer. But nonetheless, we did get quite a number of people from 10 different countries that taken together represent roughly half of the world's population. If we throw the entire sample into one model, we fully and almost perfectly replicate the original structure of the MFL. And for France, Germany, Japan, and Mexico, again, the factor structure is almost exactly the same. Very close for the USA, Brazil, Ghana, and India. So like Australia, a couple items didn't quite behave the same way, but overall the scale emerged very similarly. Turkey, the data were a bit strange, where the social items looked like they split into 2 factors. We're not quite sure what's going on there. We're working with our Turkish colleagues to decipher that. And in China, we ended up only getting 4 factors somehow, and the health and the aesthetic meanings got collapsed together. And again, we're trying to puzzle out exactly what's going on there. Saying this with several grains of salt, because I know it's a bit tricky to compare means on Likert scales across cultures, but just to give an idea of how strongly people endorse the various domains in the different cultures, you can see that here for the moral domain, there's quite a bit of variation, that on average, people did endorse it, but people in Germany and India were considerably higher than participants in Japan, for example. A bit less variation for the social domain, some huge differences for the sacred domain. Again, you can see that in many countries, people were pretty neutral on it. They didn't particularly agree or disagree that food had a sacred meaning, with the big exceptions being that it was quite often agreed to in India and Turkey, and the Germans had very little patience for the sacred domain. Again, a bit of variation in the aesthetic. Japan was the odd one out here, which is puzzling because when most of us on the team think about aesthetically pleasing food, we immediately think of Japan, but apparently the Japanese participants do not. And the health domain, again, ended up being quite similar across all the cultures. We also looked at how endorsement of the domains differs according to what people's diets are. So ranging from omnivore to an omnivore, the few restrictions like doesn't eat pork because they keep kosher or whatnot, partial vegetarians, vegetarians and vegans. And we can see pretty consistently that the further along the spectrum people go to being vegan, the more strongly they endorse all of the domains. But this is particularly the case for the moral and the sacred domain, and much less the case for the others. Now, I know that we're meant to mostly save the questions for the second bit here, but does anything immediately come to mind to you for things that you think might be missing? Any domains that you think, well, what about? If anything comes to mind, please feel free to yell into the microphone or pop it into the chat before I spoil things.
I was thinking about the political domain. Yeah, I also think, for instance, many people endorse locavorist diet for political reason, or avoid particular food items for political reason. Just think about people who, I don't know, are so-called anti-American, and so they don't eat in McDonald's, or don't drink Coca-Cola or something like that, or people, I don't know, who are against Russia nowadays, and so they don't drink vodka, just to say an example.
Thank you, Nicola. Matteo, I think I saw you unmute yourself as well.
Yeah, but maybe my point was a broader one, which maybe it's complicated to put. But, well, I was thinking about what children may think about the meaning of food. So maybe there would be a whole different domain of facets just for kids, because they probably don't have much awareness about health and stuff like that. But maybe they're more into specific social relationships, like how much they value the bond between what they eat and the producer, or what they eat, or maybe the place where they consume the food. Stuff
or
like
the
that.
Appearance of the food. We do know that kids are often very attentive to appearance. Yes, those are great. And I'm very happy to discuss this in more detail when we're not recording, but I just wanted to see before I mention the new stuff that we're doing, if anything really jumped out. The politics one is the closest to what we're going to be doing, so I'm pleased that that came to mind. So Paul Rosen and I have had an ongoing debate for the better part of 5 years now about whether or not certain things are missing from the MFL. And we're currently testing a couple things that we're tentatively calling identity connection and identity expression. So we have some items that measure, kind of like the politics item, the extent to which people feel connected to their country, to their cultural traditions, their ancestors, and their family. And we also have some items that test sort of identity expression. So the extent to which people's food choices reflect their personality, who they are, and the kind of person they consider themselves to be. It's an open question whether these are separate enough from the other domains that they'll emerge in the factor analysis, or whether people's social identity and moral identity and spiritual identity is so tied up in these that we can't really add extra factors. But it's an empirical question. We just finished collecting some data in the USA and France with these new items. We currently have data collection happening in China. And once we get through a couple more logistical hurdles, probably this week, we'll have some Indian data. All right, so being mindful of the roughly half-hour time frame here. So to quickly summarize, across multiple studies in 11 different countries, we found that there are at least, perhaps more, but at least 5 consistent domains of the meaning of food and life across cultures, namely moral, social, spiritual, aesthetic, and health. That there are large differences in the extent to which people endorse these meanings, both between and within countries. And we keep getting relatively robust and consistent relationships with dietary behaviors and other food-related attitudes. However, due to the cross-sectional nature of our work, the causal direction yet isn't really unclear. Is it that people eat a particular way because of the meanings that food has in their life, or is it that their eating behaviors have shaped the meanings that they experience and express? It's probably a bit of both, but we're hoping to do some follow-up work to see if we can actually increase the particular meaning or meanings that food has in people's lives and see what consequences that may have for their behavior and their well-being. And with that, I would like to thank you very much for your patience and say that I'm looking forward to discussing these things with you all.